Welcome back to Detective Podcast. Tonight's story creeps out of the shadows, but before we step inside, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and country in the comments and become part of our growing circle of curious minds. Now, settle in. The investigation begins. Chapter 1. The monastery of St. Cuthbert in the Wolds was a place built for echoes. Its stone corridors were narrow, its ceilings high, its walls worn smooth by centuries of whispered prayers and measured footsteps. Sound lingered there longer than it should have. Chants seemed to hover after voices ceased. Bells rang on in the mind long after the rope was stilled. The monks claimed this was a blessing. Others, less devout, said it was merely bad acoustics. On the evening the singing began, no one was inclined to argue theology. Compline had ended in orderly silence. The brothers had left the chapel 2 by 2, cowls lowered, sandals soft against the flagstones. The candles were extinguished with care. The great oak doors were barred. Silence, proper, disciplined silence, settled over the monastery like a blanket drawn up to the chin. Then the voices started. They rose not from the chapel floor, but from above it, thin at first, uncertain like breath testing the cold, a treble line, pure and steady. Then harmony, familiar, unmistakable, unmistakably human. The ancient antiphon for the feast of St. Michael, sung in Latin that had not been altered since before the dissolution. Brother Anselm froze halfway down the cloister. Brother Matthew crossed himself so hard his knuckles struck bone. From the guest wing, Father Brown paused in the act of unlacing his boots. The singing grew stronger. "It's the choir," someone whispered. "That's impossible," another replied. "The loft was sealed." The abbot emerged last, tall and stooped, his face composed in the manner of a man who had spent 40 years teaching his expression to obey his will. He listened. His lips tightened, not in fear, but in irritation. "Remain where you are," he said quietly. But monks, like men everywhere, are better at obedience in daylight than in the dark. A small knot of them drifted back toward the chapel, drawn by the sound that seemed to know their names. The choir loft stood above the nave, accessible only by a narrow stair hidden behind a panel in the north wall. That panel was locked. It had been locked for 3 days, since the death. Brother Thomas had been found there that morning. He was the youngest of the choir monks, possessed of a voice so clear that visiting scholars had made notes while he sang. He had also been, according to the abbot, restless in matters of tradition, which was a polite way of saying that he asked questions. His body had been discovered slumped beside the lectern, hands folded as though in prayer, throat marked by a dark line that suggested neither accident nor illness. The loft door had been locked from the inside. The key lay on the floor beneath his fingers. No one could explain how he had died. No one could explain how anyone could have left. And now no one could explain who was singing. Father Brown reached the chapel quietly and stood near the back, unnoticed. He was a small man, round of face, his black coat slightly shiny at the elbows. He had been invited to St. Cuthbert's to hear confessions during a retreat, and most of the monks had assumed he would be equal parts harmless and temporary. They were wrong on both counts. The voices swelled, filled the chapel, wrapped themselves around the pillars. Father Brown closed his eyes, not in terror, but in attention. He listened as one listens to a person rather than a performance. "That's Thomas's line," murmured Brother Anselm. "That rise at the third interval. He always did that." The abbot turned sharply. Silence, but the word came too late. Fear, once named, spreads like ink in water. "Ghosts," whispered someone. "Martyrs," said another hopefully. "A warning," said a third. The singing ended abruptly as though a breath had been cut short. Silence returned, not peaceful this time, but strained, expectant. The abbot exhaled. "Lock the chapel," he said. "No one is to enter the loft until morning." "And the body?" Brother Matthew asked. "The body," the abbot replied, "is already accounted for." Father Brown opened his eyes. "That," he said mildly, "depends on what you mean by accounted." The abbot turned, surprised to find him there at all. "Father Brown, is it? You are a guest." "Yes," Father Brown agreed. "Guests notice things because they don't belong." The abbot's mouth tightened. "This is a monastic matter." "So is silence," Father Brown replied. "And yet it keeps breaking." There was a pause. The abbot studied him, his mild expression, his unthreatening posture, his eyes, which were more alert than they appeared. "You heard the singing," the abbot said. "I heard voices," Father Brown corrected. "Singing requires intention." "You do not believe it was supernatural?" Father Brown smiled faintly. "I believe the supernatural is rarely so punctual." The abbot said nothing more. He dismissed the monks with a gesture and instructed Brother Matthew to escort Father Brown back to the guest wing. As they walked, Matthew's composure cracked. "Do you think it's his soul?" he whispered. "Brother Thomas's?" Father Brown considered. "If souls sang every time they were wronged," he said, "churches would never be quiet." Matthew swallowed. "Then what is it?" "Tradition," Father Brown said, "sung too loudly." Later that night, Father Brown sat at the small desk in his room, the window cracked open to the cold air. The monastery lay silent now, too silent, like a held breath. He thought of Brother Thomas's folded hands, of the locked door, of the singing that had come not from grief, but from repetition. Somewhere above the chapel, the choir loft remained sealed, and yet the voices had found a way out. Father Brown closed his eyes, not to pray, but to listen to the silence between sounds where truth so often hides. The mystery, he suspected, had less to do with ghosts than with obedience, and obedience, when misused, can be deadly. Chapter 2. Morning came to St. Cuthbert in the Wolds without consolation. The light was pale and thin, filtering through mist that clung to the abbey stones as though reluctant to leave them alone. Bells were rung for lauds, but they sounded cautious, like men choosing each word carefully. Father Brown rose early and walked the cloister before the brothers emerged. He did not hurry. He never did. Haste, he believed, was a form of pride, an assumption that truth must keep pace with impatience. At the chapel door he paused. The heavy oak still bore the faint scratch where a ring had struck it the night before. Small accidents tell large stories if one is patient enough to hear them. Inside, the abbot stood with two visitors from outside the cloister. Sir Lionel Hargreave, a local patron whose family crest adorned half the monastery windows, and Dr. Edwin Croft, a lecturer in medieval music from Oxford, summoned hastily after news of the singing reached the village. Sir Lionel looked offended by the place itself. His tailored coat sat awkwardly among the habits. "A scandal," he said, voice echoing despite his effort to keep it low. "Ghosts, voices, locked rooms, people are already whispering." Dr. Croft, by contrast, seemed almost pleased. His eyes glittered behind round spectacles. "If the acoustics are unusual, that alone would explain—" "Explain a corpse?" Sir Lionel snapped. The abbot raised a hand. "We're not here to speculate. We are here to observe." Father Brown cleared his throat gently. All three men turned, as though noticing him for the first time. "Observation," Father Brown said, "is most useful when it includes the obvious." Sir Lionel frowned. "And you are?" "A priest," Father Brown replied. which makes me professionally interested in both sins and secrets." The abbot sighed. "Father Brown has been assisting us spiritually." Father Brown smiled. "And spiritually inclined people often trip over practical facts." They stood beneath the choir loft, gazing up at its shadowed rail. The narrow door to the stair remained shut, its iron lock untouched since the previous morning. "Before we open it," Father Brown said, "may I ask a question?" Sir Lionel folded his arms. "Make it quick." "Why?" Father Brown asked. "Was Brother Thomas alone up there at all?" The abbot answered. He had volunteered to prepare the antiphon manuscripts. He was diligent. Dr. Croft nodded. "I examined his copies yesterday. They were accurate to a fault." "A fault?" Father Brown echoed. Croft hesitated. He restored older notations, removed later amendments. Sir Lionel snorted. He was meddling. Traditions exist for a reason. Father Brown glanced at him. "Sometimes," he said softly, "traditions exist to prevent questions." The abbot unlocked the door. The stair was narrow and steep, spiraling upward with the claustrophobic intimacy of a chimney. They ascended single file. Father Brown brought up the rear, his hand trailing along the stone, feeling the faint grooves left by centuries of monks making the same climb. The loft was colder than the chapel below. Dust lay thick upon the beams, undisturbed except near the lectern. The body was gone now, removed with reverence and efficiency, but its absence felt louder than its presence had been. Father Brown noticed the window first, a small arched opening, glazed but unlatched. It overlooked the cloister roof at an awkward angle. "Too narrow to climb through," Sir Lionel said immediately. "Yes," Father Brown agreed, "but wide enough for sound." Dr. Croft leaned over the rail, peering down. "The resonance here is remarkable. Even a whisper would carry." Father Brown knelt beside the lectern. He did not touch it. He simply looked. "There's a mark," he said. The abbot bent closer. A faint indentation marred the wood, shallow but deliberate. "A ring," the abbot suggested. "A seal," Father Brown corrected. Pressed repeatedly, as if someone stood here often, listening rather than singing. Sir Lionel shifted uneasily. "Are you implying—" "I'm implying nothing," Father Brown said. "I'm observing." Brother Matthew appeared at the stair, pale. "Father," he said to the abbot, "the villagers are gathered. They say the singing returned at dawn." "Returned?" Sir Lionel exclaimed. "But no one's been here." Father Brown smiled faintly. "Sound travels when silence is forced." They descended quickly. Outside, a small crowd had indeed formed, farmers, shopkeepers, a pair of schoolboys daring each other closer to the gate. Murmurs rippled when the monks emerged. An old woman crossed herself. "The dead won't rest," she said. Father Brown approached her. "Why do you think that?" "Because they're still speaking," she replied simply. Father Brown nodded. "Yes," he said. "That is often the reason." Sir Lionel pulled the abbot aside. "This must be contained," he hissed. "If it gets out that the monastery harbours—" "Truth?" Father Brown suggested mildly, having overheard. Sir Lionel flushed. "You are out of your depth, Father." Father Brown looked at him kindly. "On the contrary, depth is where voices echo. Shallow places are quieter." That afternoon, Father Brown sought out Brother Anselm in the scriptorium. The old monk's hands trembled as he worked. "You sang with Brother Thomas," Father Brown said. "Yes." "You disagreed with him?" Anselm swallowed. He said the old hymns had been edited. The meaning had been smoothed away. "And you?" "I told him obedience mattered more than accuracy." Father Brown nodded. "And did it?" Anselm's eyes filled. "Not to him." As evening approached, the monastery grew tense. Doors were shut earlier than usual. Candles burned longer. When the bells marked the hour, more than one monk flinched. At midnight, the voices rose again. This time, Father Brown was waiting. He stood alone in the chapel, listening, not upward, but sideways. The sound did not descend, it slid like breath along stone. When it ended, he smiled, not in triumph, but in sorrow. "Tradition," he murmured, "is a fine servant and a cruel master." Above him, the locked loft remained empty, but somewhere nearby, truth was finding its voice.